Hello everyone, and welcome to the 199th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring the characters and themes of Silent Hill 2. The patrons and members chose James Sunderland to be featured in an episode this month, and what good timing they had considering the remake just came out a few days ago as of the making of this video. Silent Hill 2 was remade for a very good reason, because it's one of the greatest games ever made, and giving it that bit of modernization will ensure that more and more people will get to enjoy this beautiful piece of story making. While the patrons and members chose James to be covered, I found that discussing the central characters of this story and its themes to be far more appropriate. So in this video, we'll be discussing what exactly the story is trying to impart upon us as far as good and evil is concerned. And we'll be doing so by examining the arcs of Eddie, Angela, and James. And while we'll mostly be doing so with the information we're given in the game, I will be pulling info from the novelization when appropriate. Now I wanted to include my own footage of the remake in this video, but unfortunately, I just couldn't get the graphics to behave on my computer. So thank you Gamers Little Playground for providing all the clips you'll be seeing in this video. Now most of us aren't going to find ourselves in situations where we're terrorized by villains straight out of comic books. But in a world that becomes more and more digital by the minute, there are plenty of people out there looking to take advantage of your data in any way they can. And that's where our sponsor for this video, NordVPN, comes into play. Chances are you've heard of Nord, and that's for a very good reason. Because as far as cybersecurity is concerned, Nord offers some of the best tools to protect yourself on the market. With a single click, you can activate Nord's state-of-the-art VPN, offering you an extra layer of protection against things like phishing, malware, and DDoS attacks. And with added features like Nord's Threat Protection Pro, which blocks ads and scans all files you download for any threats, and their Dark Web Monitor, which scans the dark web for any trace of your information even when you're not connected to a VPN server, you're only minutes away from significantly enhancing your online security. Nord is also good for that classic VPN use case as well, changing your location to another country so you can access some of your favorite titles on streaming platforms that might not be available in yours. Something that I use frequently when creating these videos. And for any of you frequent travelers out there, access to Nord is a must to keep your trips as entertaining and hassle-free as possible. With all the great features a VPN has to offer backed up by Nord's top-of-the-line product, you'd be a fool not to have Nord on your side. So go to nordvpn.com/theeye and use the code THEEYE at checkout, or click the link down in the description to get some exclusive deals on Nord packages, as well as 4 months of extra coverage completely free. And the best part is, Nord has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so try it and see if it's right for you, which I'm confident it will be. Thank you NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. Burdens. We all have our burdens to bear. Mouths to feed, bills to pay, relationships to maintain, homes to take care of. Life is filled with burdens both big and small, and no matter who you are, no matter how many burdens you shoulder, we all get tired, frustrated, and overwhelmed from time to time. And when we do, we can lash out at those we love, neglect our duties, and willfully or subconsciously ignore our burdens and the toll they exact on us. And when we're left standing in the wake of what we've done and what's been done to us with real or proverbial blood on our hands, it's often easier for us to stuff down our pain and our guilt than to face the reality of our situations. But to suffer burdens is to live. For everything in life, even the most wondrous things we experience, either comes with burdens that will make themselves clear eventually, or require one to burden themselves to obtain them. Ultimately, this story is about the burdens we bear, how they affect who we are, what we do, and who we become, the guilt a person feels when they take some sort of drastic measure to relieve themselves of such a burden, and our inability to face them and come to terms with the toll they've exacted upon us, and that we've exacted upon others as a result. And while navigating through this story and witnessing the stories of James, Eddie, and Angela, we're offered a unique and nuanced insight into the nature of good and evil that resonates deeply with the human experience. Silent Hill is a town with a storied history, and through the trials and tribulations of the many people that have inhabited this land for better or for worse, an ominous supernatural power has seeped into its foundation and transformed it into a curiosity, an entity that draws downtrodden, unfortunate, and guilt-ridden souls into the miasmic fog of the alternate world that hides beneath its otherwise average exterior, so they might face their inner demons in uniquely harrowing ways. For people like Laura, who are pure of heart, they only see an empty town. But for those who had any kind of darkness within them that needs to be confronted, the town will manifest those feelings into monstrous reflections of what lies within a person's heart and mind. And when confronted with your inner demons, you're given a choice. Admit what they are and come to terms with what you've done and who you are, or deny everything you're presented with and succumb to them. And each of the 3 people enduring their respective trials in this story offer us some different things to ponder. Eddie Dombrowski is a man in his early 20s who has been bullied for his appearance his entire life. Overweight with boyish features and a seemingly slower than average mind, it's easy to see how this happened to him. While bullying is a pain that most of us are fortunate enough to leave behind once we're done with school, the torment he experienced in his youth extended into his adulthood, as one of his primary bullies, a football player, continued to harass him even 5 years after high school ended. And one day when Eddie had finally had enough, he took his father's revolver and killed this man's dog. And as he fled, he also shot this man in the knee. This led to Eddie becoming homeless and wandering for a while before he met Laura and ended up in Silent Hill. Now, Eddie's trials in Silent Hill are centered around two things: his lack of self-worth and the blame he places on others for the tormented existence he lives. Do you know what it does to you, James, when you're hated, picked on, spit on, just because of the way you look, after you've been laughed at your whole friggin' life? This is something Eddie says to James in this story, and because he has had to put up with this type of negative behavior from others his entire life, Eddie has by all accounts developed a case of body dysmorphia, which is a mental disorder that causes a person to hyperfixate on an aspect of their appearance that they perceive as being negative, as Eddie truly believes himself to be a fat, ugly, and worthless person. Eddie also seems to eat away his feelings as well, giving in to the perception other people have of him, while stuffing down his feelings, as we can see when he's eating a pizza at one point in the game, and seems totally unbothered by everything he's experiencing in Silent Hill. Outside of this interaction, we find him either with his gun in his hand, or with it nearby, with the corpse of a person who's clearly been shot in the vicinity. And each time this happens, save for the last time we find him, Eddie denies that he was the one who shot them, and it's when Eddie finally admits what he's done that Eddie fails. These corpses weren't people, they were apparitions that were meant to represent Eddie's bullies, one of which he remarks was making fun of him with his eyes. In our final confrontation with him, Eddie remarks that killing the dog and wounding the bully the dog belonged to felt good. In the previous encounter, he remarks how easy it is to kill someone, and here, he states that it doesn't matter whether you're smart or dumb, or pretty or ugly when you're dead, showing us that Eddie has been led so far astray that he's now convinced that violence is the answer to every problem he's ever had. But each time these people appeared to Eddie, Silent Hill was challenging him to come to terms with the idea that these people have no real bearing on Eddie's life. They do if you let them, as Eddie clearly has, but as unavoidable as a bully can be at times, the best defense against them is to match their vitriol with things that are hard to come by in the moment when they're attacking you: kindness and confidence. Every bully who's ever bullied has done so to do one thing: get a reaction out of you. It's no fun giving another kid a wedgie if they don't scream in pain. It's much less entertaining to call someone fat or ugly if they stand their ground and declare their love for themselves than it is if they run off crying. Obviously, another solution to bullying is standing up for yourself physically, as if you can beat your bully in a fight, there's a good chance that will deter them. But chances are if you're being picked on, you're typically being picked on because that person doesn't feel threatened by you. Even if you could beat up your bully though, I'd still argue that meeting them with confidence and kindness is a better all-around solution, especially when you take into account another difficult thing to realize when being bullied, that being that typically, a bully doesn't become a bully out of the blue. They do so because something in their own lives has caused them to lash out at others as a way to hide their own suffering. All that being said, each situation is different, so generalizations can only get you so far. But with Eddie specifically, it seems that Silent Hill is trying to help him realize that the pain he's experienced at his bully's hands is only amplified by his own reaction to it. And if Eddie could just find it in himself to not necessarily forgive them, but not allow them to have any hold over his life, he'd be a much happier man for it. To do that though, you need to either learn to love yourself the way you are, or if you don't like the things about yourself that you're being ridiculed for, you change them. And because Eddie's perception of himself has been so warped by all the bullying he's endured, he can't find it in himself to do either. We all are who we are. People might make fun of us for that, but that doesn't mean they're right. And it doesn't mean you have to take what they say to you to heart. Because when it comes down to it, the only person who needs to be comfortable with who you are is yourself, and everyone else be damned. Or in other words, the only person standing in the way of your happiness in these scenarios is yourself, no matter how much you want to blame others for it. And if you can't come to terms with that, then you become like Eddie, a man lost in a cycle of anger, resentment, self-loathing, and denial. A man who believes that all of his problems lie with a cruel world that only beats people like him down. A man who, instead of facing his demons or finding peace with himself, chooses to hide away in a dark corner and eat his feelings away. And a man who has so internalized his pain that it has transformed into violent thoughts that then resulted in him taking violent actions, which only further warped his character and sent him spiraling into darkness. And indeed, that is where we last find Eddie, in darkness, in his own version of Otherworld, a cold meat locker surrounded by corpses. Angela Orozco's predicament is similar to Eddie's in many ways. Angela, at the time we meet her, is just 19 years old, a depressed, paranoid, and deeply traumatized woman who has many childlike tendencies, and the reason Angela is like this is because she had been abused by her father and brother for a significant portion of her life. While Angela's mother was also present in her life, it would seem that all she did when her daughter was suffering was stand by and reinforce to her that she deserved to receive this kind of treatment. At some point, Angela's mother decided to leave her family behind, and even though she was of no help in the matter, Angela was now forced to suffer her father and brother's abuses alone. Because of this, Angela is extremely distrustful and suspicious of men, as we can see through her various interactions with James, where she makes assumptions about his intentions with her. And in the Silent Hill 2 novelization, Angela also mentions that she worked a waitressing job at some point, where she claimed she had to contend with male customers who tried to touch her body, which could be true, but it's interesting to note that this might be a case of Angela assigning negative intentions to men because of her paranoia. With their broad grins and vulgar laughter, they stare at the waitress's uniform skirts, their gazes coiling around their legs as if to taste them. The shameless hands of the male customers, no matter how many times I smack them away, they still persist, grabbing at me, stroking the curve of my hips. Before I know it, they've changed into the hands of my father and brother. I'm not saying that these things didn't actually happen, but if they didn't, I actually think that's more heartbreaking, as the damage that her father and brother did to her psyche is so severe that Angela sees all men, no matter the circumstance, as extensions of her father and brother, which is a horrific amplification of the terror many women naturally feel in the presence of men. As if this is true, then Angela essentially lives every moment in constant fear of half the population. But a person can only endure so much torment, and eventually, Angela ended up running away from home. But eventually, her father found her and forced her to come back with him. And after resuming his abuse of her, sometime later, Angela finally snapped and murdered her father and her brother. And because she was terrified of the consequences she might face in the wake of these murders, she fled from the scene, and the road she took would end up leading her to Silent Hill. So what is Angela meant to face in this mysterious town? Well, it would be reasonable to assume that she's being forced to confront the guilt she feels for the murder she committed. And she is. But it seems to me that Silent Hill is trying to force her to realize that she shouldn't be feeling any guilt. But why would it be trying to do that? And more importantly, shouldn't she feel guilty? Maybe. Now I'd like to preface what I'm about to say with a disclaimer. The issue of whether or not an abuser deserves to die is one that's been debated on for decades, if not centuries now. And with the advent of the internet, discussions inevitably occur under every story involving abusers that's reported. And these discussions are typically heavily saturated with calls to murder that person, or, if they've already been murdered, praise for the fact that they've been murdered. The primary reason why that is because it's in our very natures for the vast majority of us to have a visceral emotional response to any sort of crimes involving the abuse of an innocent person, and rightfully so. That being said, moral issues are made infinitely more difficult to discuss when emotions override reason. And while what to do with an abuser is something that warrants a discussion, it's impossible to do so a lot of the time. As if you try to argue with someone who is vehemently kill all abusers, then they're only going to see you as a supporter and enabler of said abusers. However, a system of morals entirely built upon logic and reason isn't a good thing, and neither is a system of morals built entirely upon emotion. For example, if our system of morals was entirely derived from logic and reason, then in a situation where 10 million people are starving, it might be the case that the most logical thing to do to end their suffering, and do so efficiently, would be to kill all of them. But when such a conclusion is deemed to be the most logical course of action, it's emotion that prevents us from taking said action. As if you live in a society that kills its needy rather than helping them, even if helping them would be harder, less efficient, and more costly, well, then you live in an evil society. As though that might be the most logical solution, it doesn't take into account the fact that we are emotional creatures who are able to empathize with our fellow man, who would not want the same things to happen to ourselves or our loved ones. If we look at an example of morality ruled by emotion, you'll find the same to be true. Mob mentality is a great example of what can happen when emotions override reason. Let's say a man was just murdered, who we'll call John. And after a few days, a man appears in a bar you frequent and shouts that he knows who killed John and where to find him, which spurs you and the other patrons to pick up any weapon you can find, so you all can go and deal with John's murderer. And after setting up your kangaroo court, you judge this suspect to be guilty and promptly kill him. But then a few days later, the real murderer is caught, and now you and everyone who participated in the murder of an innocent man are as guilty as the real murderer. Unlike in the previous example, rather than thinking too much about a solution, the people involved didn't think much at all. They let their hearts decide what to do. And as much as we rely on our intuition at times, sometimes that intuition can be very, very wrong. Which is why in many civilized societies, you have things like due process and concepts like innocent until proven guilty. And because emotion is also intimately tied with laws and morality, that's why each crime needs to be judged for what it is and handled accordingly. Like with murder, as though the law, which is based on logic and reason, is very clear on what is and isn't considered murder, it's up to a judge and jury to add that crucial human element to criminal proceedings that will hopefully ensure the situation is handled accordingly after taking all its particulars into account. Now, why I felt the need to say all this to you is twofold. Because 1, I am not the all-seeing and all-knowing authority on good and evil, and I'm not trying to say that I have the perfect solution to this issue, as an issue like this isn't going to be solved in a YouTube video. And 2, because I'm going to attempt to examine Angela's situation with an equal amount of logic and emotion so we can try and get a more objective handle on whether or not Angela is in the right or in the wrong for doing what she did. And hopefully, by giving you this explanation now, I've given you adequate reasoning as to why any moral quandary, even ones involving abusers, deserve to be discussed without resorting to shouting and name-calling. And as always, because I'm not the ultimate authority on morality, if you believe my reasonings aren't adequate, I encourage you to challenge them, anything I say going forward, or anything else for that matter, down below in the comments section. Alright, with all that out of the way, if we look at Angela's situation with an equal amount of empathy and reason applied to it, what do we find? Well, first, let's reconfirm what Angela has gone through and what she's done. What we're dealing with here is a young woman who suffered perhaps a decade or more of abuse, and after attempting to leave the situation, she was forcefully pulled back into it and then ended up murdering her abusers after being backed into a corner in many ways. Now, there are potentially 3 different things that could mark Angela as guilty. If we look to the law, then it would define what Angela did as murder. If an eye for an eye is the metric you use to decide the appropriate punishment for a person, then the forced loss of decades of 2 different people's lives is not a just punishment for a decade or so of abuse. Finally, if you approach the situation with the moral idea that killing is wrong no matter what, then Angela killed 2 people, and she was wrong for doing so. However, these black and white assessments do not take into account the trauma and emotional scarring a person has to experience in this scenario. One of the more common arguments that's made when an abuser is murdered is to point out that there are many different ways the victim could have handled the situation without resorting to murder, like documenting the abuser's crimes, reporting them to authorities, or they could have just left. But whether or not those are viable options depends on the particulars of each situation and the environment one's in when they're in this situation. Documentation of an abuser's crimes could be impossible. The authorities in your area might not be of much help to you when you go to them, especially if you're a woman, and leaving might either be an impossibility or inevitably futile when your abuser catches up to you and drags you back into their world. Something else to consider is that a person being abused is typically also psychologically abused, and sometimes you're so terrified of your abuser that you would never dream of defying them because you've had it so instilled into your head that if you do, that they're going to kill you, which makes taking any of these options infinitely more difficult. But again, each case needs to be examined individually in order to discern what the best or any options a person had or has in their particular situation. So from what we know about Angela's story, what other options did she have besides murder? Seemingly none. We don't know every last detail about Angela's situation, but what we do know is that she tried to leave her family home, but she was eventually taken back by her father, and it was only after she was brought back and he began abusing her again that she murdered him and her brother. So the way I see it, with the limited information we're given, it seems Angela was unable to escape her situation, and there was no one who she could turn to who could assist her in doing so, and she only murdered her father and brother in response to the abuse she was receiving in that moment, and because she felt like she had no other options. And because that's true, I believe what she did should fall under the category of self-defense. The only aspect of this scenario that might call that into question is her murder of her brother, as it's possible that Angela targeted him after defending herself against her father, which would have made that murder more so revenge-motivated than it was a matter of self-defense. However, it's very likely that while Angela was defending herself against her father, her brother intervened, and she had to kill him to defend herself against him as well, which would make a lot of sense. So do I think Angela should feel guilty for what she's done? And is Silent Hill trying to make her feel guilty about what she's done? No, and no. From what we know, Angela had 2 choices: keep suffering the abuse of her brother and father, or take matters into her own hands, and she chose the latter, something that I don't fault her for. And I don't think Silent Hill is trying to make Angela feel guilty and punish her. Rather, it's trying to tell her that she shouldn't feel guilty. Now, I know these disclaimers and warnings can get annoying, but with sensitive issues like these, I like to be as thorough as I can be when discussing them. And I'd like to say here and now that I do not advocate for anyone who is in an abusive situation to resort to murder as their first and only option when attempting to escape their situation. It's only when all other options have been exhausted, or there are no other options, that something like this should be considered. Anyway, Angela should have never been put in a situation where she felt like her only options were to kill 2 of her family members, as not only is killing another person no matter the circumstance something that no person should ever have to experience, but having to kill the people you once loved that have since become monsters is even more horrifying. And in accordance with all the horror she suffered, Angela has been driven to the point where she is searching for a way to end her life so she might end her suffering, another aspect of her story that Silent Hill is trying to purge from her. But along with her guilt and these thoughts, there is something else that Silent Hill is trying to rid Angela of, her desire to find her mother. Angela frequently comments throughout her journey that she's looking for her mother, the woman who abandoned her to her suffering, and while it could be that she's trying to reconnect with the only family member she has left, you have to consider that Angela came to Silent Hill with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knife she used to murder her father and brother. So is it more likely that Angela is looking to reconnect with her mama, or is it more likely that she's trying to exact her revenge on the last person left standing who can be held responsible for the abuse she suffered? I think it's the latter, and this, along with the abuse she suffered, the murder she's committed, and her desire to end her existence, are all components of a larger realization that Silent Hill is trying to instill within Angela, that she is not defined by her trauma, and that despite how bleak it all might seem, life does go on, and you can forge yourself into something better if you can just realize that the sun will soon rise on a new day. While Eddie had to face echoes of his bullies in Silent Hill, Angela has to face herself and her past. At one point, we find Angela lying on the ground in her room with a gigantic mirror, and here, she's ruminating on whether or not she should end her life. We next find Angela trapped in a room made of flesh, with pistons firing into orifices, with a monstrous representation of her father tormenting her, as she lies writhing in agony. And finally, we find Angela standing on a staircase that's flanked by 2 castrated corpses pinned to the walls, with flames slowly materializing as they reflect the constant hell that she lives in. But in that mirror lies the reflection of a woman who has so much to live for. Outside the 4 walls that house the grotesque recreation of the nightmares that constantly run through her mind lies a world full of possibilities. And right behind that staircase is a door that can take her to it. She won't find her mother in Silent Hill. That's not what she should be looking for. But she can find herself and her self-worth if she could only just decipher the lessons being presented to her. Silent Hill is constantly presenting Angela with crucial questions. Will you let everything you've experienced consume you, or will you find a way to forgive and love yourself despite what you've experienced? Can you forgive and forget, or will you hold your grudge to the end of your days and let the fire of hatred and sorrow burn inside of you till the last? All Angela had to do to conquer Silent Hill and herself was leave and find hope in a better tomorrow. But unfortunately, like so many others, Angela was so mired in her pain that the only choice she felt she had left was to ascend those stairs to find a way to end her life as they turned to cinders beneath her feet, an agonizing end for a woman who only deserved to be happy and free. Eddie and Angela offer us a lot to contemplate, but of the 3 characters faced with their demons in this story, it's our protagonist, James Sunderland, whose crime is the most deserving of punishment. You're all likely familiar with the particulars of his story, but James was married to a woman named Mary, who came down with a mysterious and life-threatening disease that sentenced her to a sure death. As time went on, Mary went through hell, suffering horrific wounds all over her body and a decreasing mental state as the pain and the inevitability sent her mind reeling into oblivion. And so she steadily became violent and abusive towards her husband, which was a far cry from her typically reserved and kind persona. And after a significant amount of frustration had built up within James, he chose to murder Mary. After doing so, James entered into a state of denial, which was only exacerbated by a reliance on alcohol that he picked up during the course of his wife's illness. And after laying his wife in the trunk of his car, or in the back seat depending on who you ask, he drove off to parts unknown, eventually finding his way to Silent Hill. Here, James is forced to face dire fantasies of his own creation. Armless creatures wrapped in flesh that reflect how confined he felt. Strange erotic mannequins and nurses who represent the sexual frustration he felt as his wife lay sick and battered. caged monstrosities frantically searching for a way to escape their prison, and of course, an executioner born from James' fascination with a painting that depicted the executioners that once carried out justice in this town, the dreaded Pyramid Head, the monster that represents James' subconscious desire to be punished for what he's done. But in this dilapidated hellscape filled with monsters, there is one creature born from a wish who also haunts James, a creature more terrifying than all the other monsters he faces during his journey: Maria. Maria is everything James wished his wife could have been when she was sick. Unlike the modest Mary, Maria dresses promiscuously, and we often see her flirting with James and enticing him into being physically intimate with her. While Maria also torments James in several ways, she's nice and sweet to him most of the time, unlike his disease-ridden wife that tormented him so. But Maria, while she isn't Mary, is at the same time, and much like Pyramid Head, she appears to James to punish him, as Maria is there to remind him why he's being punished. It's a long journey from the time James arrived in Silent Hill until he's forced to come to terms with what he's done, and when we examine what James has done, he is far less deserving of understanding and sympathy than the other two players in this story. Mary was suffering from a debilitating disease that was nearly guaranteed to end her life, and yes, she became angry, and she took that anger out on those closest to her. But as horrible as it is to watch someone you love die, and as horrible as it is to be treated poorly by them when they're dying, what they're going through is infinitely worse than whatever pain you're experiencing as a result of their sickness. No amount of mistreatment from Mary in this situation would have made killing her okay, especially not for the reason James did it, which, as he eventually admits, is because he couldn't take it anymore. It was a mixture of frustration and an inability to bear seeing someone he loved so much, hurt so much, that caused James to murder his wife. Whether or not he more so murdered her because he couldn't stand living like that, or because he couldn't stand to see her in pain anymore, doesn't really matter, because both actions are derived from James' own wants and needs, without any regard for what his wife wanted and needed. From what we know, Mary was guaranteed to die, but even so, the only person who had a right to decide what Mary was going to do with the years she had left was Mary. Despite these truths though, like Angela and Eddie, we can understand why James did what he did. Having to watch your wife slowly waste away whilst putting everything in your life on the back burner is a difficult burden for anyone to bear. And with the person you're caring for also lashing out at you, the toll that all of this takes on your psyche would be enough to drive a person to murder. But just because something is understandable doesn't mean it's excusable, which James himself subconsciously knows if the literal manifestation of a creature meant to punish him is any indicator. So what is Silent Hill trying to do for James? Well, just like Eddie and Angela, it's trying to make James face the reality of who he is and what he's done. But rather than offering a clear resolution to James's turmoil, Silent Hill is trying to get James to face what he's done so he can decide what the most appropriate path for him to take is. Unlike Eddie and Angela, who needed only to put down their gun or knife and leave this town with a renewed sense of self-worth to conquer it, James' path towards reconciliation with himself is much less clear by virtue of the now 6 different endings that aren't jokes that were given in this story for him. In the Leave ending, James has a conversation with an illusory Mary where she forgives him, and he subsequently leaves Silent Hill with Laura, presumably adopting her as Mary would have wished. In the In Water ending, James is unable to live with his guilt once he finally accepts what he's done and decides to take his own life by driving himself and Mary's corpse into Toluca Lake. In the reimagined version of this ending in the remake, the Stillness ending, we get a much more heartfelt version of the same conclusion when Mary states that she'll be waiting for James on the other side. In the Rebirth ending, James is so distraught once he realizes what he's done that he resolves to revive Mary by using the dark power that lies within Silent Hill's church. In the Maria ending, James leaves Silent Hill with Maria to start his life anew with her, but before they leave, Maria coughs, signaling to us that James is doomed to repeat everything he's just went through. Finally, the New Bliss ending occurs when James is watching the tape he and Mary made, but instead of showing him smothering her, it pans to an empty chair after James picks up his camcorder in the tape, indicating that James was perhaps able to go back to a time when all was right, so he could fix his mistakes. The In Water ending has been touted as the preferred ending of some of the creators of this series, but what ending for James is actually the true one is up to each of our own preferences. Personally, I prefer the In Water ending. Every instance of Mary appearing in this story is as false a manifestation as all the monsters we see are, so whatever forgiveness she has to offer James when he's speaking to her is all born from James' own mind, and they're not the words of the real Mary, and so I don't feel that James deserved an ending where Mary is reassuring him in any way. But now that we've reached this point, we need to answer a very important question. Are any of the characters that we've discussed in this story evil? No, they're human, and I believe that's one of the central themes of this story. There is a big difference between being an evil person and being a person who's done evil things. Evil people have no regard for morality, and they will do whatever they wish, no matter what it might cost others. People who do evil things, on the other hand, do have a regard for morality, but they may have erred in a way they might not have had they not been put in certain situations. Eddie Dombrowski did not want to kill a dog and shoot his bully in the knee. He was driven to that point by everything he had experienced, and had he not been, none of that would have happened. Angela Orozco did not want to be abused by her father and brother for years on end, until she felt her only option was to murder them both. And had she not been, she wouldn't have murdered them. James Sunderland loved his wife, and only wanted what's best for her and himself, and so he felt the only way to end her suffering as well as his own was to end her life. And had she not gotten sick, that never would have happened. These three people did terrible things, and as much as I don't think James deserves any sort of redemption, he as well as Eddie and Angela are capable of coming to terms with what they did and who they are so they can move past them. Eddie should feel guilty for killing a dog and wounding a man, and he should be punished. But in accepting his guilt and weathering his punishment, Eddie might have found that it's not others who rule his world, but himself. And after paying his debt to society, or by starting fresh somewhere new, he could have come to terms with the fact that the only person who needs to accept and love him for who he is Eddie Dombrowski, and he would have been much happier for it. Angela murdered her brother and her father after enduring years of abuse, and she was alone in the world with scars carved into her soul that could have never been removed. But with the worst behind her, Angela could have found purpose in a world bereft of their influence, and if she could have learned to love herself, despite everything she'd been through and everything she'd been made to believe, her future could have been anything she wanted it to be. James should feel guilty for murdering his wife and putting his needs before someone he swore to protect. But as wretched as his crime was, James could find it in himself to forgive himself for what he's done and continue living with an ever-present guilt, always at the back of his mind. These people committed grave sins, but in the end, they are still people. People that all of us can identify with and understand, and as much as the evil actions they've taken cannot be undone, they do not define who they are, for it was only at the pinnacle of frustration and anger that they took actions they otherwise would have never dreamed of taking. And with that in mind, the true evil in this story are the feelings of despair and anguish that form in us as we shoulder our respective burdens, feelings that darken our characters in ways that we would have never imagined. But our burdens do not define us. They are integral parts of the human experience, but it's often the case that they only rule our lives if we let them. And even when we lash out in anger and frustration, when we've come to the end of our rope, or when we're given no other choice, perhaps it's best that we find the time to stop and reflect for a while, so we might understand why we did what we did, why we are who we are, and how best to live with those realities. We are all ultimately the deciders of our own fates and the architects of our lives, and while what we have planned for ourselves and the world we would like to live in gets derailed sometimes, we have to make the best of what we're given and understand that we're all only human. Sometimes evil enters into our world and we have no way of controlling it or what we feel we have to do in response to it, and while it can change us in ways we never wanted to be changed, we all have to come to terms with who we are and what we do, as we all only have one life, and the only person who has to live it is you. And you can either live it in the best way you possibly can, or let evil win and take everything from you. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Silent Hill 2? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.